October 14, 2023, 11:42 p.m. 32-year-old Daniel Harper sat alone in his apartment in Columbus, Ohio, typing what would become the final message anyone would ever see from him. Minutes later, a security camera across the street recorded something investigators would replay dozens of times. The footage shows Daniel leaving his building, walking slowly toward the parking lot, his phone still glowing in his hand. At first glance, nothing about the video appears unusual. A man stepping outside late at night, a quiet street, no visible threat. But hidden inside that ordinary moment was a detail no one noticed. Not the police who first reviewed the footage, not the detectives who later ruled his death a suicide, and not even the friends who had already read the chilling message Daniel posted just minutes earlier. Because before he walked out of that building, Daniel Harper had written something that would haunt this case for months. If anything happens to me tonight, it wasn't suicide. At the time, investigators believed the message was simply the product of fear or paranoia, something people sometimes post during emotional moments online. But Daniel Harper was not known for dramatics. He was methodical, careful, the kind of person who double-checked the locks on his doors every night and backed up his phone files every week. Which raises a question that would come to dominate the investigation. Why would someone like Daniel feel the need to leave a message like that at all? Because what detectives did not yet realize was that Daniel had spent the final weeks of his life quietly documenting something he believed might put him in danger. And when authorities finally reviewed the surveillance footage again months later, they noticed a movement in the corner of the frame that changed everything. A figure that should not have been there. A figure that appeared only seconds after Daniel walked out of view. By the time the coroner's report confirmed Daniel's worst fear, investigators understood something chilling. Daniel Harper hadn't been predicting his death. He had been warning people about it. And the evidence proving it had been sitting in that video the entire time. Everyone had been watching Daniel, but no one was watching what followed behind him. October 14, 2023. 11:42 p.m. 32-year-old Daniel Harper sat alone inside his second-floor apartment in Columbus, Ohio, staring at the glow of his phone screen. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. A few distant cars passed through the intersection down the block, their headlights briefly brushing across the brick walls of the building before disappearing again into the night. Inside Daniel's apartment, the only sound was the faint tapping of his fingers across the screen. He read the message once, then again. Then he pressed post. If anything happens to me tonight, it wasn't suicide. Within minutes, the message appeared on his Facebook page, visible to friends, family, and co-workers who had followed Daniel for years. To anyone scrolling late that night, it looked strange, sudden, out of character. But to understand why Daniel Harper wrote those words, you have to understand the kind of man he was. Daniel was not someone who chased attention. In fact, most people who knew him would describe him the same way. Quiet, careful, methodical. He worked as a data analyst for a regional logistics company headquartered in downtown Columbus. His job involved reviewing shipping records, warehouse inventories, and transportation routes for large retail chains across the Midwest. It was a career built on patterns and details. Daniel spent most of his days analyzing spreadsheets that stretched across thousands of rows. Numbers that, to most people, looked meaningless. But Daniel had a reputation at the company for noticing things other people missed. A missing shipment code, an inventory discrepancy buried in a report, a pattern that appeared once every few months but didn't belong. His co-workers joked that Daniel saw the world the same way computers did. Everything was a system. Everything had logic. If something didn't make sense, Daniel noticed. That same mindset carried into his everyday life. Daniel lived alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city. The building was quiet, mostly young professionals and graduate students from Ohio State renting units while they built their careers. His neighbors rarely heard music from Daniel's apartment. No loud parties. No arguments. Most evenings, Daniel followed the same routine. He finished work around 6, stopped at the same grocery store 2 blocks from home, cooked simple meals, then spend an hour or two reading or watching documentaries before heading to bed. His sister Megan would later say Daniel was the most predictable person she had ever known. If Daniel told you he would call on Sunday, he called on Sunday. If he said he would be somewhere at 8, he arrived 5 minutes early, which is why when his Facebook post appeared that night, several people immediately felt something was wrong, because Daniel Harper did not post dramatic messages online. In fact, he barely posted at all. Scrolling through his page showed the same pattern repeated over the years. Photos from family holidays, a few hiking trips in the Hocking Hills, occasional pictures of his dog, a golden retriever named Cooper who had passed away the year before. Nothing controversial, nothing emotional, just quiet snapshots of a quiet life. But over the previous 3 weeks, something about Daniel's routine had begun to change. At first, the changes were small. His co-worker Jason Alvarez remembered noticing Daniel staying later than usual at the office. Normally Daniel left right at 6, but in late September, Jason started seeing the lights on at Daniel's desk closer to 8 or 9. When Jason asked about it one evening, Daniel brushed it off, just cleaning up some reports. But Jason remembered something else about that conversation. Daniel seemed distracted, not nervous exactly, but focused on something that wasn't being discussed. Around the same time, Daniel's sister Megan began noticing missed phone calls. The two siblings had always been close. Their parents had passed away several years earlier, leaving Daniel and Megan as each other's closest family. They spoke almost every other day. Yet during the first week of October, Daniel canceled 2 of their regular calls. The second time, he texted instead, "Busy tonight. I'll call tomorrow." He never did. At the time, Megan assumed work was simply overwhelming him. But looking back later, there were other details that felt different. Daniel had asked her a strange question during one of their last conversations. If something weird ever happened, would you check my computer? Megan laughed when he said it. What does that even mean? Daniel paused. Just if anything happened to me, there are files on my desktop labeled logistics reports. You should look at them. She thought he was joking. Daniel changed the subject almost immediately. But the question lingered in Megan's mind long after the call ended. Then there was the email. 3 days before his final Facebook post, Daniel sent a message to his supervisor requesting access to archived shipping data from several warehouse facilities in Ohio and Kentucky. It wasn't part of his usual workload. When the supervisor asked why he needed it, Daniel replied with a simple explanation: verifying inconsistencies in routing logs. Technically, that answer made sense. But Daniel had never requested those records before. And the facilities listed in the request all had one thing in common. They were connected to the same third-party freight contractor. No one knew it yet, but Daniel had been quietly collecting information, reports, shipping records, delivery confirmations, all tied to a pattern that had started to appear inside the data. A pattern Daniel believed someone else had already noticed he was investigating. Which is why, on the evening of October 14th, Daniel's routine looked almost normal. He arrived home from work just before 7. Security cameras in the apartment hallway show him carrying a grocery bag and a laptop backpack inside. He enters his apartment at 6:58 p.m. For the next 4 hours, nothing unusual appears on the building cameras. No visitors. No one knocking at his door. Just quiet. But this is where the timeline begins to shift. Because sometime after 11:30 p.m., Daniel opens his laptop again. His internet history later shows him uploading several files to a cloud storage account, financial spreadsheets, freight manifests, and one document simply titled October Report. Then, at 11:42 p.m., Daniel picks up his phone. He types the message that would later echo across news headlines and police reports. If anything happens to me tonight, it wasn't suicide. Seconds after posting it, Daniel stands up from the couch. He grabs his jacket and walks toward the door. What happens next would seem ordinary at first. Almost too ordinary to matter. A man leaving his apartment late at night. But outside that building, across the street, a small security camera mounted above a closed convenience store was recording. The footage would later show Daniel stepping into the parking lot, glancing briefly at his phone as he walks toward the sidewalk. And at first, investigators believed that video captured the final moments of a troubled man leaving his home alone. What they didn't realize was that someone else had already been waiting in the darkness just beyond the edge of the camera's view, watching, waiting, and moving only after Daniel disappeared from the frame. But that detail would remain hidden for months, because in the early hours of October 15th, police believed they were investigating a suicide. Daniel Harper's warning was dismissed as fear, his Facebook message written off as a tragic final thought. And the most important detail in the entire case sat quietly inside a surveillance video no one thought to question. The first call to emergency services came at 12:18 a.m. on October 15, 2023. A passerby walking along the Scioto River Trail near downtown Columbus had noticed something unusual near the base of the pedestrian overlook that crossed above the water. At first, the man believed someone had dropped a jacket or a bag beside the concrete barrier. But as he walked closer, the shape became clearer. It was a person. Within minutes, police units and paramedics arrived at the overlook. The area was quiet at that hour. The river moved slowly below, reflecting the orange glow of the streetlights along the bridge. Officers quickly confirmed the victim was male, unconscious, no signs of life. Identification found in the victim's wallet listed the name Daniel Harper, 32 years old, address less than 2 miles away. The scene itself appeared simple. Daniel was lying on the paved path below the overlook, directly beneath a section of railing that stood about chest height. Investigators immediately recognized the possibility that he had fallen or jumped from above. It was a conclusion that seemed to fit the first pieces of information officers began gathering. Because when detectives checked Daniel Harper's social media account, they discovered the message he had posted just 36 minutes earlier. If anything happens to me tonight, it wasn't suicide. At first glance, it looked like a contradiction. But investigators had seen similar posts before. Emotional warnings, written during moments of distress. People leaving behind dramatic statements that later turned out to be expressions of anxiety rather than evidence of danger. Still, procedure required a timeline. Detectives began retracing Daniel's movements. The first major piece of evidence came from the security camera across the street from Daniel's apartment building. The video begins at 11:43 p.m. Daniel appears in the doorway of his building, pushing it open with one hand while holding his phone in the other. The screen lights his face for a moment as he steps outside. He pauses briefly on the sidewalk. Then he begins walking toward the corner of the block. His movements look calm, measured. Nothing about his behavior suggests panic or fear. He doesn't look behind him. He doesn't appear to notice anyone nearby. Within 10 seconds, Daniel exits the camera's field of view. At that point, investigators believed the footage had shown exactly what they expected. A man leaving home late at night after posting a troubling message online. The next confirmed sighting came from traffic cameras 2 blocks away. At 11:49 p.m., Daniel is seen crossing High Street alone, heading toward the riverfront walking path. Again, nothing unusual. No one walking beside him. No vehicle stopping. No sudden movements. By midnight, the cameras near the river trail show a figure matching Daniel's clothing entering the pedestrian overlook. And then the cameras show nothing more. The overlook itself had no surveillance coverage directly above the section where Daniel was found below, which meant investigators were left with only circumstantial evidence. A troubling social media post, a solitary walk toward the river, and a fall from a bridge railing shortly after midnight. The medical examiner's office conducted the autopsy later that morning. Initial findings indicated Daniel had died from injuries consistent with a fall from significant height. There were no obvious defensive wounds, no signs of struggle. Toxicology would take weeks to complete, but early observations suggested no immediate evidence of intoxication. To many investigators, the case seemed painfully straightforward. A man experiencing stress or fear posts a message online. He leaves his apartment late at night. He walks to a secluded overlook, and within minutes, he climbs the railing. By the afternoon of October 15th, the case was already being informally discussed inside the department as a likely suicide investigation. But there were people who refused to accept that conclusion. The first was Daniel's sister, Megan. She arrived in Columbus that same evening after receiving the devastating phone call from police. And when detectives showed her the Facebook post Daniel had written hours before his death, Megan reacted immediately. That's not him. Detectives explained that the message could reflect fear, confusion, or emotional distress. But Megan insisted they were misunderstanding her brother completely. Daniel didn't panic. Daniel prepared. If he believed something might happen to him, Megan said it meant he had a reason. The second person who questioned the conclusion was Daniel's co-worker Jason Alvarez. When Jason heard about the death 2 days later, he remembered the late nights Daniel had been working at the office. He remembered the strange data requests. And most importantly, he remembered the question Daniel had asked him just 1 week earlier. Have you ever noticed shipments that disappear for a few hours in the system? At the time, Jason assumed Daniel was talking about routine tracking errors. But now the question felt different. Jason shared that conversation with investigators. Detectives took note, but saw no direct connection between Daniel's work and his death. Still, they examined Daniel's laptop and personal files. What they discovered appeared confusing rather than revealing. Multiple spreadsheets, shipping manifests, route logs, hundreds of entries connected to freight shipments moving through distribution hubs in Ohio and Kentucky. There was no clear explanation for what Daniel had been studying. No written report. No note explaining the purpose. Just rows of data and timestamps. Investigators concluded Daniel had likely been working on an unfinished analysis related to his job. Without context, the files meant very little. But this is where the investigation quietly narrowed in the wrong direction. Because detectives believed the most important question had already been answered. Why Daniel died. They believed they were simply filling in the remaining details. In early November, toxicology results returned. No drugs, no alcohol. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death blunt force trauma from a fall. The manner of death was listed as suicide. The case was effectively closed. But one final piece of evidence remained archived in the investigation file. The surveillance footage from the convenience store camera across the street from Daniel's apartment. Detectives had reviewed the clip once, maybe twice. Each time they focused on the same subject. Daniel walking out of the building. No one else visible. Case closed. What they never noticed was that the video didn't actually end when Daniel left the frame. The camera kept recording. And 23 seconds after Daniel disappeared around the corner, something else entered the edge of the screen. A shadow moving along the wall of the building. A person stepping into view. Someone who had clearly been standing just outside the camera's angle the entire time, watching Daniel leave, then following him into the darkness. For months, that figure remained unnoticed, because everyone reviewing the footage believed they had already seen everything that mattered. They were watching Daniel, but the truth was hidden in the seconds after he vanished. For nearly 4 months, Daniel Harper's case sat quietly inside a closed file. The official conclusion never changed. The medical examiner's report listed suicide. Police records described a solitary walk to the river and a fatal fall. To most people outside Daniel's family, the story ended there. But inside a small office at the logistics company where Daniel had worked, someone kept thinking about the question Daniel asked days before his death. Jason Alvarez couldn't forget it. Have you ever noticed shipments that disappear for a few hours in the system? At the time, Jason assumed Daniel was chasing one of the strange data quirks analysts sometimes stumbled across. Temporary gaps in tracking logs, delayed scans, small glitches in enormous databases. But after Daniel died, the question started to feel different. Because Jason eventually opened the files Daniel had been working on. Hundreds of spreadsheets, rows of delivery records, freight trucks moving between distribution warehouses across Ohio and Kentucky. At first, the information looked random, but Daniel had highlighted specific shipments, specific routes, and more importantly, specific time gaps. Jason noticed the pattern almost immediately. Certain freight containers would leave one warehouse and arrive at the next location hours later than the recorded travel time should allow. Yet the GPS logs never showed the truck stopping. The system simply skipped forward. A missing window of time. Sometimes 2 hours, sometimes 3. But this is where everything changes. Because when Jason checked the freight contractor connected to those shipments, he discovered something unusual. The same third-party company appeared in nearly every flagged route Daniel had been studying. A contractor responsible for transporting electronics, pharmaceuticals, and high-value retail goods across the Midwest. Jason forwarded the information to police. At first, detectives weren't convinced it had anything to do with Daniel's death. But one investigator reviewing the material noticed something else. Daniel's final upload to his cloud account. The document titled October Report. Inside that file was a single paragraph Daniel had written shortly before his Facebook post. It read like a note to himself. Containers rerouted temporarily off record. Stops not logged in system. Someone altering timestamps. But the most chilling line appeared at the bottom. If they know I'm looking at this, I might be in trouble. Detectives reopened the case. And the first piece of evidence they returned to was the surveillance footage from the convenience store camera. The same clip they had already reviewed months earlier. This time, investigators watched longer. The video begins the same way it always had. 11:43 p.m. Daniel exits the apartment building. Phone in hand. He walks toward the corner. He disappears from view. But the video keeps running. And 23 seconds later, something finally moves inside the left corner of the frame. At first it looks like a shadow along the wall. Then a person steps forward. A man wearing a dark jacket and baseball cap. He pauses for a moment, looking in the direction Daniel had just walked. Then he follows. When investigators slowed the footage down, another detail became visible. The man had been standing less than 6 feet from the building entrance the entire time, just outside the camera's original field of view, waiting. This single detail rewrote the entire case. Because Daniel had not left his building alone. He had been followed. Detectives immediately began tracing nearby surveillance cameras along the route Daniel walked toward the river. The traffic camera on High Street showed Daniel crossing the road at 11:49 p.m. But when the footage was examined again, frame by frame, the same man appeared 30 seconds later, crossing the same street, moving in the same direction, maintaining distance, always behind him. From there, investigators located footage from a parking garage camera facing the river trail. At 11:56 p.m., Daniel enters the walkway leading to the overlook. 14 seconds later, the man in the dark jacket follows. But the camera angle revealed something detectives had never seen before. As the man passes under the light, his face becomes visible for less than a second. And facial recognition software produced a name. Evan Mercer, 38 years old, a regional operations manager for the same freight contractor Daniel had been investigating. What they didn't notice was that Mercer had access to the very shipping systems Daniel had been analyzing, which meant Mercer would have known if someone inside the logistics company began pulling records connected to those routes. The timeline suddenly made sense. Daniel discovers irregular shipments. He begins collecting evidence. Mercer notices someone accessing the freight logs. And by October, Mercer likely knows exactly who is asking questions. Phone records placed Mercer's device near Daniel's apartment the night he died. But the most important evidence came from a final camera positioned near the river overlook. The camera faced the entrance to the walking path. At 12:01 a.m., Daniel enters the frame. He pauses briefly near the railing. But he doesn't climb it. He stands there, looking out toward the water. Then, 8 seconds later, Mercer approaches from behind. The two men appear to speak. The camera has no audio, but their body language shows tension. Daniel steps backward. Mercer moves closer. Then the two figures briefly disappear behind a support column near the railing. 3 seconds later, Mercer walks away alone. Daniel never reappears. The coroner re-examined the case. The injuries were still consistent with a fall. But now investigators understood what Daniel had been trying to say in his final message. If anything happens to me tonight, it wasn't suicide. He wasn't predicting his death. He was documenting the threat he believed was coming. Evan Mercer was arrested in April 2024. Prosecutors later revealed investigators uncovered evidence that Mercer had been diverting high-value freight shipments off-route for years. Electronics and pharmaceuticals temporarily removed from containers during undocumented stops. Millions of dollars in stolen goods quietly reintroduced into the supply chain before delivery. Daniel's data analysis had uncovered the pattern. Mercer's defense claimed the confrontation at the river overlook had been an argument that escalated unexpectedly. But prosecutors presented the surveillance timeline. Mercer waiting outside Daniel's apartment, following him across the city, approaching him on the bridge minutes before his fall. The jury deliberated for less than 7 hours. Evan Mercer was convicted of second-degree murder. Today, Daniel Harper's final Facebook message remains frozen on his profile page. Friends still visit it, still read the words he left behind. Because what makes the message unforgettable isn't just the warning. It's the fact that Daniel Harper was right. He knew something was wrong. He knew someone might try to silence him. And he left behind the one clue investigators almost ignored. A message that forced people to look closer. A message that proved the truth was there all along. Sometimes the most important evidence in a case isn't hidden. Sometimes it's written plainly for everyone to see. You just have to believe the person who left it behind.